What happens when the universe stops answering? When the signs you've been receiving every single day for years suddenly vanish into absolute silence? This is the story of a man who learned that sometimes the most profound answer is no answer at all. Before we dive into this extraordinary journey, if you're drawn to stories that explore the mysteries of faith, consciousness, and the unseen forces that shape our lives, subscribe now and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. This story will change the way you think about divine communication forever. The beginning of signs. Thomas Meridian had been asking for signs since he was 7 years old. It started the night his mother died, when he knelt beside his bed in the darkness of their small apartment and whispered into the void, "If you're real, if she's okay, please show me something." The next morning, a white feather lay on his windowsill, pristine and impossibly placed on the 3rd floor with no trees nearby. No birds that could have left it there. He kept that feather in a small wooden box for the next 35 years. From that moment forward, asking became his ritual, his anchor, his way of navigating a world that seemed too vast and chaotic to comprehend alone. Every morning, Thomas would stand at his window, coffee in hand, and speak softly to whatever might be listening. "Show me I'm on the right path," he would say, or "Give me a sign about this decision," or simply, "Let me know you're there." And every single day, without fail, something would appear. A cardinal landing on the fence at precisely the moment he asked. A stranger wearing a shirt with exactly the words he needed to hear. A song on the radio with lyrics that addressed his specific question. License plates, cloud formations, chance encounters, all of them arriving with such precise timing that coincidence seemed impossible. His wife Sarah had found it charming at first. This quirk of her husband's, this belief in a universe that spoke directly to him. But as the years progressed and Thomas's reliance on signs deepened, she began to worry. "You can't live your whole life waiting for permission from the sky," she told him one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the clouds in shades of amber and rose. Thomas had smiled, squeezed her hand, and pointed upward. "See that cloud formation? It looks exactly like a thumbs up. That's my permission for tomorrow's meeting." Sarah had laughed, but her eyes held concern. Thomas worked as an architect, a profession that seemed fitting for someone who saw patterns and meaning in everything around him. He designed buildings that incorporated sacred geometry, structures that aligned with celestial events, spaces that felt inherently peaceful to those who inhabited them. His clients never knew that many of his most inspired design choices came from signs he'd received, from the angle of light through a window he'd noticed while walking, from the shape of a leaf that had fallen onto his drafting table, from dreams that arrived with architectural blueprints already formed. His work was celebrated, featured in magazines, studied in universities. Thomas attributed all of it to his ability to listen, to ask, to remain open to guidance from sources beyond his rational mind. His daughter Emma had inherited his sensitivity, though she expressed it differently. While Thomas sought signs, Emma seemed to simply know things, to feel truths that others missed. She would call him moments before he planned to call her. She knew when he was struggling with a project without him mentioning it. "We're connected to something bigger, Dad," she told him once when she was 16 during a conversation about intuition and faith. "But I think we're not supposed to rely on it for everything. I think sometimes we're supposed to just trust ourselves." Thomas had nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in her words, but privately he disagreed. Why trust only yourself when you could trust the infinite intelligence of the universe? For 42 years, this was Thomas's life. 42 years of asking and receiving, of question and answer, of seeking and finding. He asked about career moves and received clear direction. He asked about relationships and saw unmistakable confirmations. He asked about his health, his finances, his purpose, and always, the universe responded. He became known among his friends as Lucky Thomas, though he would correct them. "It's not luck," he would say. "It's alignment. It's partnership with something greater." Some friends found it inspiring, others found it unsettling. But none could deny that Thomas's life seemed to flow with unusual grace, as if invisible hands were gently guiding him through every decision, every crossroads, every moment of doubt. On the morning of his 50th birthday, Thomas stood at his window as he had done thousands of times before. Sarah had planned a small party for that evening, just close friends and family. Emma was flying in from Seattle where she worked as a therapist. The morning was crisp and clear, early autumn turning the leaves into flames of gold and crimson. Thomas held his coffee, felt its warmth seep into his palms, and spoke his question into the breaking day. What does this next chapter hold for me? Show me what I need to know about the path ahead. He waited, watching the street below, the sky above, feeling certain that something would arrive. Something always arrived. A car passed with the license plate Trust 50. A neighbor walked by wearing a shirt that read, "The best is yet to come." A pair of hawks circled overhead, their wings catching the morning light. Thomas smiled, recognizing the messages, feeling the familiar comfort of being heard, being guided, being held by forces beyond his understanding. But what Thomas didn't know, couldn't have known as he stood there bathed in the golden light of his 50th birthday morning, was that this day marked a threshold. The signs he had received so faithfully for 42 years, the daily confirmations that had shaped his entire worldview, were about to change in a way he could never have anticipated. The universe that had spoken so clearly for so long was preparing to teach him a lesson far more profound than any sign could convey. A lesson that would require him to walk through the valley of absolute silence, to face the terror of unanswered questions, to discover what faith really means when all external validation disappears and you are left with nothing but the echo of your own voice calling out into an empty sky. The silence descends. It began so subtly that Thomas didn't notice it first. 3 days after his birthday, he asked for guidance about a new project, a museum that would require the most innovative design of his career. He stood at his window, asked his question, and waited. The street remained quiet. No birds appeared. No meaningful license plates drove past. The clouds drifted aimlessly, forming no recognizable shapes. Thomas frowned, checked his watch, and realized he was running late for a meeting. "I'll check again later," he told himself, dismissing the absence as coincidence, as poor timing, as nothing significant. But later brought no signs either, nor did the next day or the day after that. By the end of the first week, a small seed of anxiety had planted itself in Thomas's chest, sending tiny roots of worry through his body. He tried different approaches, asked different questions, stood at different windows at different times of day. He walked through parks looking for signs in nature. He drove through the city watching for meaningful synchronicities. He meditated, prayed, pleaded, demanded, bargained. The universe remained utterly, devastatingly silent. Sarah noticed the change in him immediately. Thomas became distracted, distant, obsessively checking his surroundings for any hint of meaning, any fragment of guidance. "What's wrong?" she asked one evening, finding him standing in the backyard long after dark, staring up at the stars. "Nothing," he lied, unwilling to voice the fear that was growing inside him like a cancer. How could he explain that the foundation of his entire life, the invisible architecture that had supported every decision and belief, seemed to be crumbling? How could he admit that he felt abandoned, cut off, suddenly and inexplicably alone in a way he hadn't felt since he was 7 years old, crying beside his mother's empty bed? 2 weeks into the silence, Thomas made a mistake at work. Not a catastrophic error, but significant enough. He had always relied on signs to guide his design choices, to tell him when something was right or wrong, to confirm his instincts. Without that guidance, he second-guessed everything, changed his mind repeatedly, and ultimately submitted plans that his senior partner called uninspired and derivative. Thomas sat in his office after that meeting, head in his hands, wondering if his talent had always been borrowed, if he had ever really been the architect, or if he had simply been a conduit for something else, something that had now withdrawn its presence. Emma called that night, and this time Thomas didn't hide what was happening. The signs stopped him, every single one. "It's been 2 weeks and there's nothing." He heard her take a deep breath on the other end of the line, heard the careful consideration in her silence before she spoke. Dad, maybe this is a sign too. Maybe the message is that you don't need them anymore. Thomas felt anger flash through him, hot and sharp. You don't understand. You've never understood. This isn't about need. It's about partnership. It's about being in conversation with the divine. Emma's voice softened. Or maybe the divine is asking you to have a different kind of conversation, one that doesn't require constant external validation. They spoke for another hour, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that even his own daughter had abandoned him to this inexplicable exile. By the third week, Thomas had descended into what he could only describe as spiritual crisis. He stopped going to work, calling in sick with a vague illness that wasn't entirely untrue. He felt sick with doubt, sick with fear, sick with the sudden terrible suspicion that everything he had believed for 42 years might have been nothing more than elaborate self-deception. Had the signs ever been real? Had he simply seen what he wanted to see, found patterns where none existed, mistaken coincidence for cosmic communication? The thought made him physically ill. He began researching obsessively, reading about confirmation bias, about the psychology of pattern recognition, about how the human brain is wired to find meaning even in randomness. He read about other people who claimed to receive signs, about the faithful of various religions who believed in divine guidance, about skeptics who explained it all away with neuroscience and statistics. The more he read, the more confused he became, caught between faith and doubt, between what he had experienced and what logic suggested, between the reality he had inhabited for decades and the frightening possibility that it had all been illusion. Sarah tried to help, bringing him meals he barely touched, sitting with him in the darkness of their bedroom, holding his hand while he stared at the ceiling. You're still you, Thomas. With or without signs, you're still the same brilliant, kind, creative person. But Thomas shook his head. You don't understand. Without the signs, I don't know who I am. I don't know how to make decisions. I don't know what's real anymore. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not for the signs, but for the man she loved who seemed to be disappearing into his own private abyss. 1 month into the silence, Thomas sat alone in his study at 3 a.m, surrounded by journals he had kept for 42 years, each one filled with documented signs, recorded synchronicities, evidence of what he had always believed was an ongoing dialogue with the universe. He read through them now with different eyes, seeing how he had interpreted everything, how flexible his definitions had been, how easily a random occurrence could be molded into a meaningful message if you wanted it badly enough. He read about the feather on his windowsill when he was 7, the feather he had treasured as proof that his mother was okay, that God was real, that someone was listening. Looking at it now through the lens of doubt, it seemed so small, so explainable. A bird could have dropped it. The wind could have carried it. It meant nothing, nothing at all. He opened the small wooden box he had kept for 45 years and pulled out the feather. It was yellowed now, fragile, barely more than a memory of itself. Thomas held it between his fingers, felt its weightlessness, its delicacy, and before he could stop himself, he crushed it. The feather disintegrated into dust, into atoms, into nothing. Thomas stared at his empty palm, at the faint residue that was all that remained of his first sign, his first proof, his first moment of belief. And then he wept, great racking sobs that shook his entire body, crying not just for the feather, but for everything it represented, for the innocent boy who had believed, for the man who had built his entire life on that belief, for the faith that seemed to have died between his fingers like dust. What Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't see through the fog of his despair, was that this silence was not abandonment, but initiation, not the end of communication, but the beginning of a far more profound conversation, one that would require him to journey into the deepest chambers of his own soul, to face the parts of himself he had avoided for 42 years by outsourcing his certainty to the sky, to discover that the voice he had been seeking outside himself had been waiting inside him. All along, patient and eternal, ready to speak the moment he became quiet enough to listen. The dark night. The second month of silence transformed Thomas from a man in crisis to a man dismantled. He stopped bathing regularly, stopped shaving, stopped caring about anything beyond the obsessive loop of questions that consumed his mind. Why had the signs stopped? What had he done wrong? Was he being punished? Was this a test? Or was the cruelest answer the simplest one, that there had never been anything there at all, that he had wasted 42 years of his life in conversation with his own echo? Sarah reached her breaking point on a Tuesday afternoon when she came home to find Thomas sitting on the floor of his study, surrounded by torn pages from his journals, the documented evidence of decades of signs ripped and scattered like autumn leaves. "This has to stop," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "You're destroying yourself over something that was supposed to bring you peace. You're so focused on what you've lost that you can't see what you still have." Thomas looked up at her with hollow eyes. "What do I still have? A career built on borrowed inspiration? A faith that turned out to be fantasy? A life that only made sense because I believed someone was guiding it?" Sarah knelt beside him, took his face in her hands, forced him to meet her gaze. "You have me. You have Emma. You have yourself. When did that stop being enough?" Her words cut through the fog for a moment, sharp and true. But then the doubt closed in again like water, drowning everything in its relentless tide. Thomas knew Sarah was right on some level, knew he should be grateful for what remained, but gratitude required a perspective he no longer possessed. He was like a man who had lost his sight after 50 years of seeing, everyone telling him to appreciate his other senses while all he could focus on was the absolute darkness, the unbearable absence of light. Emma flew home that weekend, canceled her appointments, told her clients she had a family emergency. She found her father sitting in the backyard, unshoded, unshaved, staring at nothing. She sat beside him in silence for a long time before speaking. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me. What you're going through this dark night of the soul, it's not unique to you. Every mystic, every seeker, every person who has ever tried to touch the divine has gone through this. It's called the dark night for a reason. It's when everything you thought you knew gets stripped away so that something deeper can emerge." Thomas turned to look at his daughter, this wise young woman who seemed to understand things he had missed, despite all his signs, all his supposed connection. What if there is nothing deeper? What if this is it, this emptiness, this silence? Emma smiled sadly. "Then you sit with the emptiness. You sit with the silence. You stop running from it, stop trying to fill it, stop demanding that it transform into something else. You just sit with it until you realize that the silence has its own voice." He wanted to believe her, wanted to find comfort in her words, but belief felt like a muscle he had overused for too long, now too exhausted to contract. Instead of arguing, he simply asked, "How? How do I sit with something that feels like it's destroying me?" Emma took his hand. "You start by forgiving yourself for being human. You forgive yourself for needing signs in the first place, for building your faith on external confirmations, for not knowing how to trust your own inner wisdom. And then you just breathe and wait and see what emerges from the silence." That night, alone in his study, Thomas tried to follow his daughter's advice. He sat in meditation for the first time in months, not asking for anything, not seeking any sign, just sitting with the suffocating weight of silence. At first, his mind screamed with questions, with demands, with the desperate need to fill the void with something, anything. But as the minutes turned to hours, something shifted. The silence stopped feeling like abandonment and started feeling like space, like a vast open territory he had never allowed himself to enter because he had always been too busy looking for the next sign, the next confirmation, the next piece of external validation. In that space, memories began to surface, moments he had forgotten or dismissed as insignificant. He remembered times when he had known what to do without asking for a sign, when his own intuition had spoken clearly and he had acted on it with confidence. He remembered the joy of creating not because the universe had told him to, but because creation itself was its own reward. He remembered falling in love with Sarah not because of any cosmic confirmation, but because her presence made him feel more alive, more himself. more real. He remembered Emma's birth, holding her for the first time, feeling a love so profound that no sign could have prepared him for it. No external guidance could have told him what it meant to be a father. These moments had their own validity, their own truth, independent of any feathers or synchronicities or meaningful coincidences. Thomas began to cry again, but these tears felt different, less about loss and more about recognition, about seeing for the first time how much of his life had been genuinely his own, how much wisdom and strength and love he possessed, independent of any divine messaging service. He had been so focused on the signs that he had missed the miracle of his own existence, the extraordinary fact of consciousness itself, the incomprehensible gift of being alive, aware, capable of love and creativity and wonder. As the night deepened, Thomas had what he could only describe as a vision, though it came without images, without symbols, without anything external at all. It was more like a deep knowing that arose from within, a voice that sounded like his own but carried a wisdom that felt both ancient and new. The voice said, "I never left you. I was never outside you. Every sign you ever received was you recognizing yourself in the mirror of the world. Every question you asked was you trying to remember what you already knew. The silence is not my absence. It is my invitation for you to discover that we were never separate, that the guidance you sought has always been the guidance you possessed, that the light you were looking for has always been the light you are." Thomas sat bolt upright, his heart pounding, every cell in his body vibrating with a truth so obvious he couldn't believe he had missed it for 42 years. The signs had been real, but not in the way he had understood them. They had been real because he had made them real, because his consciousness had reached out into the world and found reflections of its own knowing, because the universe had responded to his questions the way a mirror responds to a face, showing him back to himself. And now, in the silence, the mirror had been removed so he could finally see what was real beneath all the reflections, so he could finally encounter himself directly, without mediation, without translation, without the need for external confirmation. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the sleeping city, at the stars wheeling in their ancient patterns, at the vast mysterious presence of existence itself. And for the first time in 2 months, Thomas smiled. The silence was still there, as complete as ever, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full, pregnant with possibility, with invitation, with a love so unconditional that it required nothing from him, not even his belief. The universe had not abandoned him by stopping the signs. It had loved him enough to remove the training wheels, to trust him to ride on his own, to discover that he had never needed permission from the sky, because the sky was not separate from him, because everything was one infinite expression of the same mysterious presence, and he was as much a part of that presence as any feather, any cardinal, any perfectly timed synchronicity. Thomas understood now that this was not the end of his spiritual journey, but its true beginning, that everything before had been preparation for this moment, for this falling away of the false architecture he had built around the sacred, for this direct encounter with the truth that required no signs because it was self-evident, self-confirming, self-luminous, as obvious as his own existence, and as mysterious as the source from which all existence flows. The answer was silence. 3 months after the signs stopped, Thomas returned to work. His colleagues barely recognized him. The man who came back was quieter, more grounded, less likely to reference cosmic confirmations or divine guidance. But there was something new in his eyes, a depth that hadn't been there before, a certainty that seemed to come from within rather than from external validation. His first project back was the museum he had been avoiding, the one that had seemed impossible without signs to guide him. He approached it differently this time, sitting with the empty space of not knowing, allowing ideas to emerge organically from his own creative depths, rather than waiting for the universe to whisper directions. The design that emerged was the most innovative of his career, a structure that seemed to breathe with organic intelligence, spaces that held silence like a sacred presence, galleries that invited contemplation rather than consumption. When his senior partner reviewed the plans, he sat back in his chair and whistled low. "Thomas, I don't know what happened to you these past few months, but this is genius. This is the work of a master." Thomas smiled, accepting the compliment without deflecting it to divine inspiration. "Thank you," he said simply, and meant it. Emma visited again in month 4, found her father in the backyard garden he had started tending, his hands in the soil, his face peaceful in a way she hadn't seen since childhood. They talked for hours about what he had learned, about the dark night, and what lay beyond it. "The thing is," Thomas said, pulling weeds with methodical care, "the signs were never wrong. They were real, but I misunderstood their source. I thought they were messages from something outside me, but they were always reflections of my own deeper knowing. My mistake wasn't in seeing signs, it was in giving away my power to them, in making them the authority instead of recognizing that the authority was always within me." Emma nodded, understanding in her eyes. "So what happens now? Do you still ask for signs?" Thomas paused, considered the question. "Sometimes. But it's different now. I ask the same way you might consult a friend or look at a weather forecast. I'm interested in what shows up, but I don't need it to tell me what to do. I trust myself now. I trust the silence. I trust that even when I'm wrong, even when I make mistakes, I'm still connected to something vast and intelligent and loving that is not separate from who I am." Sarah joined them in the garden, brought lemonade, sat on the grass between her husband and daughter. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. No birds appeared, no clouds formed meaningful shapes, no cosmic synchronicities manifested. Just a family together, breathing the same air, grateful for the simple, profound miracle of being alive. And somehow, in that moment, it was more than enough. Thomas continued his spiritual practice, but it transformed in ways he couldn't have predicted. He still meditated, but instead of asking for guidance, he simply sat in the presence of the silence, allowing it to reveal its depths. He discovered that silence was not empty, but infinitely full, that it contained every possible answer because it was the source from which all questions arose. He learned to listen not for signs but for the subtle movements of his own intuition, the quiet knowing that lived beneath thought, the wisdom that needed no external confirmation because it was self-validating. He started writing again, something he hadn't done since college, filling journals with reflections on his journey from signs to silence, from seeking to finding, from belief to knowing. He wrote, "For 42 years I searched for God in feathers and license plates, in synchronicities and meaningful coincidences. I built an entire theology on the belief that the universe was sending me messages, that I was in constant communication with something greater than myself. And I was right, but not in the way I thought. The communication was real, but it wasn't a dialogue between separate entities. It was the universe talking to itself, consciousness recognizing itself in infinite forms, the one pretending to be many so it could have the experience of relationship, of discovery, of love." He continued, "The silence that terrified me, that nearly destroyed me, was the greatest gift I ever received. It forced me to stop looking outside myself for permission to exist, for validation of my worth, for confirmation of my path. It forced me to fall back on my own resources and discover that those resources were infinite, that I contained everything I had been seeking, that the light I was chasing was the light I was, that the voice I was listening for was the voice I am." A year after the signs stopped, Thomas organized a small gathering of friends and colleagues, people who knew about his spiritual crisis and had watched him navigate the dark night. They gathered in his newly renovated home office, a space he had redesigned to honor both the journey that had ended and the one beginning. On the wall hung a single piece of art, an empty frame, beautifully crafted in wood he had shaped himself, containing nothing but the white wall behind it. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "The Sign of No Signs." Thomas stood before his friends and spoke about his experience, about the years of asking and receiving, about the sudden silence and the crisis it provoked, about the journey from despair to discovery. "I used to think faith meant believing in signs," he said. "I thought it meant trusting that the universe would guide me if I just learned to listen carefully enough. But I understand now that real faith is trust without conditions, love without requirements, certainty without proof. Real faith is the silence that holds all sound, the emptiness that contains all form, the not knowing that is the source of all knowledge. He paused, looked around at the faces of people who loved him, people who had supported him through his darkest hours. The signs didn't stop because I did something wrong or because God abandoned me or because what I experienced wasn't real. They stopped because I was ready for something more, even though I didn't know it. They stopped because the universe loved me enough to remove the crutches, to trust me to walk on my own, to discover my own authority. And in that discovery, I found something far more reliable than any sign could ever be. I found myself. And in finding myself, I found everything. The gathering ended with silence, a full minute of it, everyone simply sitting together in the presence of something that required no words, no symbols, no external validation. And in that silence, Thomas felt more connected, more guided, more held than he ever had in 42 years of signs, because now he understood. The answer was not in the silence. The answer was silence itself, the great spacious presence in which all of life unfolds, the eternal witness that watches without judgment, the unconditional yes that underlies even the apparent no, the love that requires nothing, because it is everything. Thomas Meridian continued to live, to work, to create, to love. He made decisions based on intuition, reason, trial, and error, the same messy, beautiful process every human navigates. Sometimes he was right, sometimes he was wrong, and both outcomes became teachers. He never received another sign in the way he used to, and he never asked for one. He didn't need to. He had learned that the greatest sign is the one that points to its own irrelevance, the answer that dissolves all questions, the guidance that teaches you to guide yourself. On his 51st birthday, Thomas stood at his window as he had done so many thousands of times before, but this time he didn't ask for anything. He simply stood in the presence of the morning, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, hearing the sounds of the waking city, breathing in the mystery of another day granted, another chance to be alive. A white feather drifted past his window, caught on an updraft, spinning in the golden light. Thomas watched it pass without reaching for it, without needing it to mean anything more than what it was. A feather, floating, beautiful in its simple existence. And somehow, in not needing it to be a sign, it became the greatest sign of all, the one that said, "You are free now. Free to be yourself, free to trust yourself, free to know that you were never separate from the infinite intelligence you were seeking, that you are the answer to every question you ever asked, that you always have been, that you always will be." The silence remained, vast and complete, and Thomas had learned to hear its wisdom. In the absence of signs, he had found certainty. In the darkness of doubt, he had discovered light. In the terror of aloneness, he had realized unity. The universe had not stopped speaking to him. It had simply changed languages, shifting from the external symbols he had relied upon to the internal knowing he had always possessed. And in that shift, Thomas Meridian became whole, no longer divided between the seeker and the sought, no longer waiting for permission from the sky, no longer asking for signs, because he had finally become one. And if you are listening to this story right now, perhaps it is not by chance. Perhaps you too have been asking for signs. And perhaps this moment is not here to answer you, but to remind you that the answer has always been within you. When you stop asking, you begin to hear. When you stop seeking, you begin to remember. If you feel called to continue walking through stories like this, stories of silence, awakening, and inner knowing, you are welcome to stay. Subscribe and allow these moments of stillness to find you when you need them most. Stay present, trust the silence, and allow life to meet you where you are.